He could already see the battle unfolding in his mind, the echo of gunfire bouncing off stone, the panic of men realizing no rescue would reach them in time. He requested clearance to engage. The answer came back clipped, bureaucratic, emotionless. Negative. Visibility compromised. Ground units too close. Stand by for further instruction. He sat there in silence, his gloved hands gripping the throttle so tightly his knuckles went white beneath the leather. Static filled his headset. Below, men were dying. Above, his world narrowed to one simple, unbearable truth: the rules were killing the very people they were meant to protect. He thought of Captain Ryan Hale, the SEAL who'd once shared a beer with him under a desert sky. Ryan had saved his life after an IED shredded Kyle's convoy years ago, pulling him from a burning vehicle before it exploded. "We don't leave our own," Ryan had said. Those words lived in Kyle like scripture. Now Ryan's voice was breaking through the radio, hoarse, ragged, fighting through chaos. "We need air, now." The command center repeated their order. "Do not engage. Maintain altitude." Kyle looked out through the canopy. The mountains below were jagged teeth in the fading light. He thought of the 11 names etched into his helmet. He thought of Ryan. And then he pushed the throttle forward until the A-10 roared. The aircraft dropped through the clouds like a silver blade. Wind screamed across the fuselage, but Kyle's world went silent. Every sense sharpened, the taste of metal on his tongue, the scent of hydraulic oil in the cabin, the pressure in his chest as gravity took hold. He flipped off the safeties and armed the GAU-8 cannon. Below, the SEALs looked up and saw the impossible, a lone A-10 diving through fire. It wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist. But it came anyway, low and brutal, the sound of defiance written in smoke. Kyle's rounds ripped through enemy positions with surgical precision. He drew their fire, turning the tide by sheer will. But every pass he made put him closer to the mountain walls, to the narrow point where one miscalculation meant death. His instruments screamed warnings, but he didn't care. He was saving them, one run at a time. He could hear Ryan's voice again, clearer now. "We see you, Hog. God bless you, brother." For an hour, he flew like that, weaving through the valley, ignoring direct orders, until the enemy broke and fled into the mountains. The SEALs were alive. 381 souls who should have died that night were breathing because one man refused to obey. When he landed back at base, there was no celebration waiting for him. Only silence. The airfield lights reflected off the scorched skin of his aircraft. The ground crew stared, half in awe, half in fear. Kyle climbed out slowly, his boots hitting the tarmac like lead. A senior officer met him on the runway. The man's expression was stone. Flames clawed at the dark Afghan sky, licking the horizon in furious streaks of orange and black. The valley below was a nightmare of gunfire and chaos, the kind of place where seconds decided who would live to see the dawn. 381 Navy SEALs, trapped in a basin of rock and dust, were being surrounded on all sides. Their radios crackled with static and desperation. Ammunition was running low. The wounded were stacked under makeshift tarps, and the air stank of burning diesel and blood. Above, invisible behind the smoke and the night, a single voice broke across the comms, calm, grounded, impossible. "Hold your position," it said. "I'm coming in." They didn't believe it at first. Nobody could have. The command center had already denied close air support. The valley was too narrow, the visibility too poor, and the rules, the endless, suffocating rules, forbade anyone from flying that low, that fast, over friendlies pinned down by enemy fire. Every pilot knew it. Every commander had already moved on to damage control. But one man didn't. Major Kyle Mercer sat in the cockpit of his A-10 Thunderbolt, the titanium beast they called the Warthog. He could feel the vibration of its engines like a second heartbeat beneath his ribs. The radio chatter filled his headset, warnings, orders, threats of court-martial. He didn't answer. He just looked down through the haze and saw the flickering tracer rounds tearing into the valley where Americans were dying, and he made his choice. He broke every rule written in the book. It started hours earlier, before the sky burned, when Kyle had still believed he could obey. He'd been stationed at Bagram Air Base for 6 months, flying Overwatch missions for special operations teams scattered across the mountains. The A-10 was his home, a brutal, beautiful machine built to protect ground troops. Its armor could take hits that would shatter other aircraft, its cannon could stop a convoy cold. It was made for saving lives. But lately, Kyle had felt its purpose being buried under new restrictions, new politics, new caution from those far removed from the dust and blood. He carried the weight of an old failure. 3 years before, a SEAL team he'd been assigned to support had been ambushed in Kunar province. He'd been ready to drop into the valley, to clear the ridges and open an escape, but the command had delayed authorization. Too risky, they'd said. By the time permission came through, the team was gone. 11 men. Their names lived in his helmet, etched in silver beneath the visor. He carried them like ghosts, whispering to him every time the engines roared. Kyle had promised himself he'd never wait again. That promise was tested when the call came in, Eagle team pinned, multiple wounded, requesting immediate CAS. He recognized the coordinates instantly. A stretch of terrain known as the pit. Sheer walls on 3 sides, a perfect trap. You disobeyed direct orders, he said. You violated engagement protocol. You jeopardized your aircraft. Kyle didn't answer. He just looked past him, toward the mountains where the smoke still lingered, toward the men who were alive because of him. Within hours, he was grounded. His wings suspended pending investigation. The official report would call his actions reckless insubordination. They would say he endangered lives. They would strip his name from commendation lists and bury the mission under classified review. But the story didn't stay buried. The SEALs began to talk. Not to the press, not for glory, but to the families of those who'd been saved. Word spread, whispers at first, then louder. One A-10 came for us when no one else would. They called him the angel in the storm. At the hearing weeks later, Kyle stood alone before the review board. The room was cold and sterile, filled with uniforms and clipped voices. They listed his violations one by one: unauthorized descent, breach of command protocol, failure to maintain altitude. Each charge felt like a nail sealing a coffin. When they asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he remained silent for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, I was taught never to leave anyone behind. No one spoke after that. Outside, as the board deliberated, the hallway began to fill. It started with one man, a SEAL in dress blues, standing at attention. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the corridor was lined with rows of them, shoulder to shoulder, their faces solemn, their eyes unflinching. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was thunder. When the door finally opened, the officers stepped out to find 381 SEALs standing in formation, the same men Kyle had saved. Every one of them saluted. The gesture was wordless, but it carried more weight than any defense ever could. The commanding officer paused, his expression softening, his voice barely above a whisper. Major Mercer, he said, you're reinstated. The air in the hallway seemed to shift. For a moment, time itself held still. Kyle didn't smile. He just returned the salute, his eyes steady, his voice even. We don't leave our own. That night, the base was quiet. The mountains loomed dark against the stars. Kyle sat alone beside his aircraft, the Warthog's steel skin glinting in the moonlight. He traced the names etched on his helmet, the 11 who hadn't made it, the ghosts who had guided his hands. He whispered their names one by one, a prayer and a promise all at once. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was a man who'd done what needed to be done when others looked away. He knew there would always be another valley, another set of rules meant to protect but written by those who'd never felt the weight of lives hanging in seconds. But he also knew something deeper now, that honor wasn't found in obedience, but in compassion strong enough to defy fear. Weeks later, a letter arrived. It bore no insignia, no signature, just a line written in steady hand, for the man who flew through hell so others could live. Inside was a single patch, a black fabric insignia shaped like wings, stitched with the words, 381. He never wore it on his uniform. He kept it in his flight bag, folded beside a photograph of his crew and a note from Ryan Hale that said simply, "We're home because of you." Years would pass before the story became public. When it finally did, veterans around the world stood in silence. They understood the weight of that choice, the unbearable tension between duty and conscience. They saw in Kyle Mercer not rebellion, but redemption. In every briefing room where someone mentioned rules of engagement, someone else would whisper his name. And in every dark sky where a pilot hesitated before diving into danger, the thought would echo, one man broke the rules, and 381 came home. His story became more than legend, it became a mirror. A reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear dictate what's right. Even now, if you were to stand at Bagram's airfield long after midnight, when the desert wind hushes the world into stillness, you might hear the faint whisper of engines, not real, not physical, but carried in memory. The ghost of a warthog sweeping low through the mountains, the sound of one man's heart refusing to surrender. The moral lines between obedience and compassion will always blur in war. But there are moments, rare, sacred moments, when one man's defiance becomes the reason hundreds of others get to live. Kyle Mercer never asked for forgiveness. He didn't need it. He'd already been granted something far greater, the silent gratitude of every man who had lain bleeding in that valley and looked up to see salvation cut through the smoke. And somewhere, beyond all rank and regulation, that will always mean more. To everyone listening now, this story is a reminder that real heroism often goes unseen, that the greatest acts of courage are sometimes quiet, defiant, and done at unbearable cost. If you've ever known someone who stood between danger and the defenseless, take a moment to honor them. Tell their story. Wherever you are watching from, remember this: courage isn't in the medals, or the uniforms, or the words written in reports. It's in the silent choice to do what's right, even when the world demands you don't. Because somewhere out there, there's always another valley. Another cry for help. Another man or woman deciding, in a heartbeat, that saving lives matters more than following orders. And maybe, just maybe, another A-10 waiting to fly through the storm.